Thanks, Jen. Hello, I'm Shereen Benjamin, Edinburgh Eastern CLP, and representing the Labour Women's Declaration Working Group. Very proud to represent them today. And I'm going to talk about the erasure of women in the labour and trade union movement. I'm going to suggest 5 lines in the sand we need to draw. But first, I think we need to take a cold, hard look at where we are. Our Labour front bench have shown themselves in the last few days to be ignorant and cowardly. Keir Starmer blustered that we need a proper discussion with proper views, by which he seemed to mean Stonewall-approved views. David Lammy called us dinosaurs hoarding rights. Rachel Reeves stumbled her way through 2 interviews looking terrified of saying the wrong thing. And most especially, they seem unable to say the word woman. And this is becoming horribly familiar. Just out of interest, has anyone here asked a question about women's rights in a hustings or a meeting with your MP or a union meeting, and you've asked about women's rights and been given a lecture on trans oppression? That happened to anyone? Yep. Making the word woman quite literally unsayable and women's rights invisible is the erasure of women in plain sight. This is where we are. And most Labour politicians and senior trade unionists are at best complicit. So what do? I'm going to suggest 5 things on which I think we should insist. They're starters. Some of them need a lot more discussion and strategizing. I'm putting them to you as ways to get the conversation back on track where it should be, centering women. First, consistently name the issue under discussion as the women's rights issue, not the trans rights issue, because that's what it is. It's an issue over who can access women's rights and on what basis. So every time we hear a reference to the trans rights debate, let's consistently point out the reality. It's about us. Second, we assert our right to the term woman. As materialist feminists, we know that sex is dimorphic and fixed. Women and girls are biologically female people, and the appropriation of women's bodies and reproductive labour is an enduring constituent of capitalist societies. Women are oppressed on the basis of sex, and to fight that oppression, we have to be able to name ourselves unambiguously as women. And just to digress for a moment, think of what's going to be lost if we allow to be stolen from us the ability to name ourselves as women, oppressed on the basis of sex. We won't be able to name or talk about our experiences as a sex class, which means we won't be able to develop ways to explain and address our oppression. We won't be able to collect reliable data about the effects of law and policy on women and girls, so we won't be able to work out sensible measures to address sex-based inequalities or evaluate the effectiveness of those measures. We won't be able to talk about the places where sex matters, prisons, hospitals, and refuges where women need single-sex provision. And we won't be able to defend women's right to participate safely and fairly in sports, as we've heard about this evening. And I could go on. But to go back to our 5 lines in the sand. Third, let's confidently name this mature, respectful discussion that Keir talks about as a discussion about a conflict of rights. The demand for sex self-ID, whether that's the reform of the GRA still on the table in Scotland, or self-ID by default happening via policy capture throughout our institutions, that demand for rights and provisions on the basis of self-identified gender identity is in conflict with our hard-won and still needed sex-based rights. There's a basic incompatibility. If you provide facilities separated by gender identity, they're no longer single-sex. It's obvious, or it should be, but not to those who say there is no conflict. We need to have a proper grown-up discussion about how to resolve that conflict. It's not good enough for the Labour front bench to wring its collective hands and bemoan the toxicity of the debate. The debate is toxic because gender identity lobbyists and their enablers refuse to acknowledge that there's a rights conflict. We can't even begin the discussion until the leaders of our movement acknowledge that women still want and need the sex-based rights that lawfully belong to us. And no, Rachel Reeves, No Rachel Reeves, none of us wants a discussion that begins and ends with women's reproductive organs. And no Keir Starmer, we don't want to bandy slogans around. That's not what we're about. What we need to do is address the conflict of rights in specific contexts like sports, as discussed here this evening, so that everyone has the best possible provision, protection, and opportunities. That's the mature, respectful discussion we need. Which brings me to the fourth point, evidence. To put women back in the picture, we need evidence about where and why sex matters. We've heard some this evening, there's lots more where that comes from. But there's missing pieces of the jigsaw. Evidence that hasn't been collected and needs to be. Evidence about women self-excluding from domestic violence shelters because they can't be confident they'll find a female-only space. Who's collecting that data? No one. Evidence about girls opting out of sports because they can't trust their safety and dignity will be protected. It's not collected because the institutions making those changes don't care. The other thing that's missing is evidence that gender identity lobbyists should be providing themselves. We're asked to believe that changes to law and policy won't compromise women's rights. Show us the evidence. Show us more than a few discredited statistics on suicide. Show us how you know that our safety, privacy, and dignity aren't at risk. Or if they are, how you propose to mitigate that risk. So as well as producing evidence ourselves, and we've been very good at that, let's insist that the institutions making changes and the lobbyists calling for change, they also put their evidence on the table. Because resolving rights conflicts requires that evidence-based conversation. Keir doesn't seem to know what he wants when he says we need a mature, respectful conversation. That's the one we need. And so to point 5, we insist on being heard. We're not dinosaurs, we're not about to be wiped out. We stand our ground, strategize, support each other, speak up whenever we can, have each other's backs, and make it clear that we're here and we're determined not to be written out of the labour and trade union movement. It's our movement. Our mothers and grandmothers helped to build it, we sustain it, and we intend to pass it on to our daughters and our granddaughters in a fit state. Thank you very much.